Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, the top 10 heart-wrenching and heroic on-screen sacrificial deaths. Contrary to what a lot of people might tell you, it's okay to shed a tear or two over TV and movie characters. No, you're not watching real people struggle through life and death, but that doesn't change the fact that fiction can pack one hell of an emotional wallop. And nothing hits you harder in the feels than when one character heroically sacrifices his or her life to save others. In the video today, we're looking at 10 of the most tear-jerking and heroic sacrificial deaths in movie and television history. By the way, and this kind of goes without saying, but there are spoilers ahead. Number 10. Terminator 2, the T-800. There are a couple of reasons this scene isn't a little higher up in this video. The first is that obviously the T-800 is really just an extremely advanced computer. It doesn't have real emotions, it doesn't feel pain, and so forth. It'd be like watching someone take a hammer to your laptop. Yes, it sucks, but it's not like you can't just go and replace it with an upgraded model. And that brings us to our second point. The T-800 was simply replaced by another version of that particular model in later movies, giving this version's sacrifice far less permanence. That said, this was always a tough scene for any kid who identified with Edward Furlong's John Connor. And while the T-800 wasn't a real person, he certainly had enough self-awareness to understand that the greater good depended on his being destroyed. The world simply had no future as long as he existed. And say what you will about the thumbs up being a bit emotionally manipulative, it still totally worked. Number 9. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2, Snape. Now, here's a scene that's a little different from the others on this list. Severus Snape, the conflicted occasional antagonist and secret protector of Harry Potter, isn't necessarily sacrificing himself here. Instead, his sacrifice goes a lot deeper and lasts a lot longer than anyone else on this list. As pretty much anyone watching this already knows, Snape's heroism isn't encapsulated in this one scene simply because the sacrifice he was making lasted nearly 2 decades. As Harry discovers, Snape was consistently putting himself in harm's way in order to both keep the son of his romantic rival safe and to keep the most evil wizard the world has ever known from rising up and seizing power. In a very real, well, in terms of the story way, Snape's sacrifice didn't just help to save the wizarding world, but indeed the world as a whole. Every Muggle owes his life to Snape because the next people on Voldemort's hit list were Muggles. Number 8. The Flash, Eddie Thawne. For some of you, there's probably little confusion because you're not overly familiar with any shows on the CW, let alone The Flash. But stick with us here because it absolutely belongs on this list. Throughout the first season of The Flash, it slowly reveals that the Reverse Flash, Barry Allen's nemesis, is from the future. He traveled back in time with the explicit purpose of killing Barry Allen as a child, but he failed. Now, we're not going to explain that because Doc Brown's not around to explain all the paradoxes. Meanwhile, the woman Barry loves is dating a detective named Eddie Thawne. It turns out the Reverse Flash is a descendant of Eddie, though he takes tremendous pleasure in letting Eddie know that he's perhaps the most inconsequential Thawne in the family's history. Fast forward to the end of the first season when it appears that the Reverse Flash is about to murder Barry Allen and everyone he loves. Eddie Thawne, the seemingly insignificant guy that everyone kind of writes off, shoots himself, thereby erasing any descendants from the timeline, including the Reverse Flash. He sacrifices his own life for the good of humanity, but more importantly, in order to save Barry and the woman that they both love. Number 7. Independence Day, Russell Casse. Yeah, we know Independence Day is cheesy and schlocky and maybe a little overly patriotic. I mean, come on, the movie is named after the 4th of July, so what else would you expect other than the movie equivalent of the Pledge of Allegiance? Anyway, while it's fun to knock Independence Day in retrospect, it also certainly doesn't change the fact that perhaps the dopiest character in any disaster movie ever gets an extremely emotional send-off. Russell Casse is a really pretty tragic character, and not just because he's played by Randy Quaid. He's a drunk, he's a laughingstock, his children only barely tolerate him, and he screws up with startling regularity. But as is revealed during the climax of the film, he's also astoundingly courageous and will do absolutely anything to keep his children safe. So when all hope is lost, he single-handedly turns the tide by flying his jet into the alien ship, destroying it, and not just saving his children, but also showing the US military how to defeat the aliens once and for all. It's totally okay to get a little teary-eyed when he looks at the photo of his kids and finds that he has the resolve to do what needs to be done. Number 6. Armageddon, Harry Stamper. Staying with the corny 90s disaster flick genre, we come to Armageddon. This is not to be confused with the movie Deep Impact, which told basically the same story, just with far less Aerosmith. Now, yes, the premise is pretty absurd, to the point where even Ben Affleck points out how dumb it is to train drillers to become astronauts rather than the other way around on the commentary track. And do not even get us started on that damn space dementia. That said, you can't argue that the end of the film isn't an emotional gut punch. Much like in Independence Day, all hope seems to be lost. The fate of the world seems to be sealed, but then Bruce Willis does Bruce Willis things, which during this stretch of his career meant saving the day. The most emotional scene is probably the last conversation that he has with his daughter, as he says goodbye just before he sacrifices his life to get the job done and keep everyone safe. Number 5. The Fellowship of the Ring, Boromir. Sometimes it's better to watch the extended director's cut of a movie. Despite the versions being released to theaters already clocking in at around 3 hours, there's just so much that needed to be cut from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Perhaps there are no characters who suffered more than Boromir and his brother Faramir from these editing decisions. Boromir becomes a much more fleshed out character in the extended editions. His motivations become clearer with regard to his actions through the first movie. But that doesn't make his death any less heroic. Tempted by the One Ring, as nearly all men are, the generally heroic Boromir is nearly turned into a villain in its presence. Once he's clear of its power, however, he realizes his mistakes and immediately begins to atone for them. As an army of orcs swarm Merry and Pippin, Boromir enters the fray and single-handedly fights off dozens in an attempt to save their lives. Ultimately, his efforts fail and the two hobbits are taken by the orcs. Not all heroic acts are successful, and in a scene like this, it's plenty devastating to see his courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Number 4. Lost. Charlie. Speaking of enormous kicks to the feelings, we come to Charlie Pace, the misfit, drug-addled former rock star on the series Lost who turned out to have the most heroic death in the entire run of the show. If you never saw Lost, it's going to be a little difficult to explain how we got to this point in the show, and let's be honest, the whole thing got way too convoluted anyway. But here's the quick version. In Season 3, a boat arrives at the island. The people on board claim to have been sent by Penny, the wife of another castaway on the island who's called Desmond. Desmond and Charlie find themselves in an underwater communications station. Charlie makes contact with Penny, who informs him that she doesn't know about the new arrivals. However, just as this happens, an explosion floods the communications room. Charlie is trapped inside and his death is imminent. It's at this moment that the formerly selfish and spoiled drug addict makes his final moments count. Rather than simply accepting his fate, he uses those final moments to write "Not Penny's boat" on his hand and holds it up to the door for Desmond to see. By doing this, he warns Desmond and, by extension, the other castaways. In his final moments, he makes his life and his sacrifice matter. Number 3. The Iron Giant. Iron Giant. It's kind of amazing how frequently cartoons make us cry. And we're not just talking about bawling when Bambi's mum got shot. Now let's be honest, nothing can touch the giant sacrifice at the end of The Iron Giant. Arguably, this could well be the most often overlooked classic animated film of all time. Now yes, it has enjoyed a bit of a resurgence over the last few years, but it's pretty amazing how quickly it came and went upon being released in 1999. The anti-war, anti-paranoia story centers on a friendship between a young social outcast and, well, an Iron Giant. The US government becomes convinced the robot must be a Cold War weapon and should therefore be destroyed. A panicked government agent, even after witnessing the giant save the lives of children, launches a nuclear missile, failing to realize until it's too late that he's just ordered a small Maine town to be nuked to oblivion. The giant, understanding what's about to happen, intercepts the nuke and flies it into space, where it detonates, destroying him instantly. Fortunately, those sad tears are quickly replaced by happy ones. The film ends on a hopeful, uplifting note. Scattered remnants of the giant are seen inching their way towards each other. Clearly, much like the giant's idol Superman, the fallen hero will rise again. Number 2. Game of Thrones. Hodor. Hold the door. Man, who could have guessed that those 3 words could have such emotional resonance. Game of Thrones has been filled with blood and death. It's the kind of show where, if you're an actor, as soon as you get cast, you start looking for your death in the script. So it's hardly a shock anymore when a beloved character dies. But that doesn't make Hodor's fate any easier to stomach. Over the first 5.5 seasons, Hodor was simply the gentle giant. He was simple, only able to say his own name, and as we learned in Season 6, it wasn't even his real name. No one could have expected the origin of the name Hodor to be such a game-changer on the show. It turns out the normal stable boy's mind was forever altered by Bran Stark, the same boy he grew up destined to protect. The reveal that his entire destiny was to die in order to save Bran was monumental. However, with all of the deaths that the show has filmed, Hodor's sacrifice is by far the most heroic, and considering his fate was never really his own, it is also the most tragic. Number 1. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Spock. Come on, of course this is going to be in the number 1 spot. I mean, who would expect any different? After all, this is a scene whose message is so powerful, the needs of the many outweighs the needs of the few or the one, that it's become a part of our lexicon. It's been co-opted by philosophy professors and politicians alike. It's the most iconic scene in any Star Trek movie and solidified the Kirk-Spock relationship as one of the strongest in science fiction history. At the end of Wrath of Khan, the titular villain is on the verge of completing his, wrath. As is the trend in this video, all hope seems lost, but that's when Spock locks himself in the engine room, cutting off the radiation emanating from inside. He's able to restore power to the Enterprise's warp drive and save everyone, except for himself. So I really hope you enjoyed that video, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new videos every single day. Also, I've got a podcast. It's called BrainFood, and it's educational, entertaining content just like this. It's a bit longer form and it goes into a lot more depth on a specific subject, really getting into all of those fascinating little details. You can check it out through the link in the description below, or just by searching your favorite podcast app for BrainFood. And if you like this YouTube channel, you are sure to love that podcast. But if you want to watch something else right now, why not check out a related video from the TopTenz archives over there on the right? And as always, thank you for watching.